The afternoon sun cast a faint glow over Washington, D.C., as Karoline Leavitt, 27 years old and the youngest White House press secretary in history, rested in her upscale apartment near the White House. The small silver cross on the collar of her navy blue blazer, a symbol of her faith from New Hampshire, glistened as she stood. Suddenly, her phone rang. President Trump was calling. "Karoline, there's a religious case at the D.C. local court. A group of Christians is suing after being banned from praying in public. Go, observe, report," he said, his voice urgent, leaving her no time to think. Karoline's apartment reflected her discipline. Documents neatly stacked, business attire prepped in advance. Today she chose a simpler look. A blazer, white shirt, black pants, but still wore the cross out of habit. As Trump's spokesperson, she was used to handling crises, but this was different. This was personal. She quickly got into her sleek black SUV, maneuvering through crowded traffic. NPR blared the news, but she turned it off, focusing on the unexpected assignment ahead. Karoline pushed through the glass doors of the D.C. local courthouse, stepping into a stifling, chaotic space. The murmur of the crowd mixed with the clacking of keyboards from the clerk's corner. Citizens awaited hearings on minor cases, traffic violations, contract disputes, all blending into a low hum. She glanced at her watch. 2:53 p.m. Just minutes before the religious case was set to begin. Choosing a hard wooden chair in the middle row, she set down her document bag and opened her phone to take notes. The silver cross on her neck shimmered under the fluorescent lights, though she barely noticed the eyes fixating on her. The courtroom, though small, felt cramped and oppressive. A middle-aged man wearing a t-shirt emblazoned with "I am King" sat a few seats away, scrolling on his phone. To her right, a young woman with an oversized necklace, shinier than a chandelier, whispered to her lawyer. Karoline frowned. Clearly, the dress code here wasn't strict. She refocused, documenting details of the Christian group's lawsuit against the government for banning public prayer in a local park. This was an issue Trump wanted to make a symbol for conservatives. She was his eyes in the room. The wooden door behind the judge's bench swung open, and Judge Charles Hargrove stepped out. At 62, he carried a rigid demeanor, salt and pepper, hair combed back, wire-rimmed glasses slipping down his nose, and a perfectly pressed black robe. The crowd fell silent as he took his seat, his cold, sharp gaze sweeping the room. "All rise," called James Wilson, the tall, stern-faced bailiff. Karoline stood with the others, phone still in hand, studying Hargrove as he banged his gavel. "This is a court of law, not a stage for personal expression," he declared, his voice deep and cutting. Cases moved swiftly. A man fined $50 for parking in the wrong spot. No argument. A woman behind on rent, given a light warning. Karoline took notes, observing how Hargrove ran his court like a machine, efficient but cold. She glanced at the man in the "I am King" shirt as he presented a minor neighbor dispute. The judge made no comment about his attire. The woman with the oversized necklace was called up next. Again, nothing was said. Then Hargrove's eyes landed on Karoline. He hesitated, flipping through papers, narrowing his gaze behind his glasses. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his tone icy yet cautious. Clearly he recognized her from White House press briefings. Karoline met his stare with natural composure. A murmur rippled through the room as others recognized her, too. "That cross," Hargrove said, pointing at her neck. His tone hardened. "It doesn't belong here. This courtroom is neutral, not a place to display faith." Karoline scanned the room. No sign prohibited religious symbols. Her voice was clear, unwavering. "I'm Karoline Leavitt, White House press secretary. I'm here to observe a case for work. This is a personal item protected under the First Amendment. I'm violating no rules." Hargrove's expression darkened. "Work or not, this is not the place to make a statement," he snapped. "The courtroom is neutral, not a church." He banged his gavel again as if to reassert his authority. Near the bench, James Wilson, the bailiff, tilted his head slightly, watching. Mrs. Thompson, the middle-aged court clerk with her hair pulled into a tight bun, stopped typing. She glanced at Karoline with curiosity. Across the room, the man in the t-shirt and the woman with the oversized necklace exchanged whispers. Clearly, surprised that Judge Hargrove hadn't noticed them, Karoline stood still, gripping her phone tightly. She realized instantly, Hargrove wasn't just targeting her. He was targeting the cross itself, a symbol he seemed to despise. "Sir, I have the right to wear this under the First Amendment," she said, her voice calm but firm. Hargrove cut her off immediately. "Don't lecture me on the law. Step up to the bench now." The crowd held its breath. Karoline took a steadying breath and stepped forward, her heels clicking lightly against the worn wooden floor. The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on her. The silver cross on her blazer's collar caught the light, a small flame against the storm gathering around her. Judge Hargrove, perched above her, narrowed his eyes behind his wire-rimmed glasses. His face darkened, a flush of irritation creeping up his neck. "So what exactly are you doing here with that thing, Miss Leavitt?" His voice was low, sharp as a razor. Karoline met his gaze without hesitation. "I'm here on duty, sir, and I have the right to wear this," she replied. Her fingers tightened around her phone, her thumb discreetly sliding to the recording function. Hargrove slammed his gavel onto the desk, the crack of it echoing through the chamber. "I've seen plenty like you," he sneered, "thinking faith gives them the right to disrupt wherever they please. This is my courtroom, and I say it's not allowed." He leaned forward, gripping his gavel. "Do you realize this behavior could be considered contempt of court?" Karoline furrowed her brow, scanning the room. The man in the "I am king" t-shirt sat unbothered. The woman with the oversized necklace whispered to her lawyer, ignored, yet her tiny cross was a problem. "Sir, I am not disrupting anything," she said steadily. "I'm here for work, and my attire does not affect these proceedings. If there's a specific ban on religious symbols, I'd like to see the written rule." Hargrove smirked, a cold, humorless grin. "A rule? I am the rule here. You walked into my courtroom disrespecting the law, and now you have the nerve to demand documents?" He slammed the gavel again, harder this time. Across the room, Mrs. Thompson's fingers hesitated over the keys, her expression tightening. A murmur spread through the crowd. An older man in the back row shook his head, whispering to his neighbor. "That woman's necklace is bigger. Why isn't anyone saying anything?" Near the bench, James Wilson, the bailiff, tilted his head, observing. He'd worked here for 15 years. He'd seen this before. Hargrove's focus on Karoline wasn't about the law. It was something else. Karoline inhaled slowly, knowing a direct confrontation wouldn't change anything. She chose the long game. "Sir, if I've broken a rule, I have the right to a clear explanation," she said, subtly adjusting her phone to ensure the recording continued. Hargrove sneered, his eyes gleaming with condescension. "Here's your explanation." He raised his gavel. "I'm fining you $500 for contempt of court." The gavel slammed down. A gasp rippled through the room. Mrs. Thompson looked up sharply, unease flickering across her face. A young woman in the gallery turned to her friend, whispering, $500? Just for a cross? The man in the "I am king" shirt chuckled under his breath but quickly silenced himself as Hargrove shot him a glare. "You'll pay before you leave," Hargrove continued, his tone almost smug. "Maybe this fine will teach you to respect order. This isn't a church, Miss Leavitt, nor a stage for your performance." He leaned back as if victorious. Karoline remained motionless, her sharp eyes locked onto him. She could feel the weight of the room pressing in, waiting for her reaction. "Sir, I understand your ruling," she said, her voice steady, but beneath it a quiet steel. "But I have one question. Why aren't the others in this room, with printed shirts and oversized jewelry, being fined as well?" Silence. Hargrove's face flushed. His grip tightened around the gavel, knuckles whitening. "Don't change the subject," he snapped. "You're the only one bold enough to bring a religious symbol into my courtroom." "That's the difference." Karoline nodded slightly as if confirming what she already suspected. She said nothing more. But her mind was clear. Hargrove wasn't just biased. He was deliberately targeting Christian faith. Across the room, Mrs. Thompson resumed typing, but her fingers trembled. In 12 years as Hargrove's clerk, she had rarely seen him fine someone so harshly for something so trivial. James Wilson stood near the bench, arms crossed, his gaze carrying a hint of empathy as he observed Karoline. He had watched Judge Hargrove handle hundreds of cases, but this was different. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Despite the no filming rule, a few people discreetly raised their phones. Karoline remained still, her fingers gripping her own phone, her mind racing. This wasn't just about a fine. It was about something much bigger. "Are you done, sir?" she asked, her voice soft but razor-sharp. Hargrove frowned, momentarily thrown by her composure. "Not yet," he snapped. "You'll pay, and I'll move on. Now sit down." Karoline didn't sit. Instead, she took a step closer to the bench, resting her hand lightly on its edge, her eyes never leaving his. "I'll pay," she said, her voice low but steady. "But we're not done here." Hargrove smirked, but the confidence behind it faltered. Karoline stood her ground at the defendant's stand, her silver cross glinting against her navy blazer like a quiet act of defiance. The air in the D.C. courtroom was thick with tension. Hargrove's face remained flushed, his grip on the gavel still tight, as if it alone held his authority together. Mrs. Thompson, the clerk, had stopped typing. Her anxious eyes flickered between Karoline and the judge. Wilson, the bailiff, tilted, his head slightly, sensing something bigger about to unfold. Hargrove finally broke the silence. "Did you hear me, Miss Leavitt? $500, payable today. Sit down. We have other business." He banged the gavel, but Karoline didn't budge. She took a slow breath, then placed both hands on the bench's edge, her voice clear, calm, cutting through the room like a blade. "Sir, before I sit, I need to clarify a few things. For the record." Hargrove frowned. "The record? You have no right to demand anything here," he snapped. But there was a waver in his voice, like he sensed the ground shifting beneath him. Karoline didn't flinch. Instead, she pulled a small, gold-embossed card from her bag and held it up for all to see. "I'm Karoline Leavitt, White House press secretary, serving under President Donald Trump." The room gasped. The man in the "I Am King" t-shirt gawked. The woman with the oversized necklace leaned toward her lawyer, whispering furiously. Hargrove stiffened. His hand, still clutching the gavel, froze in midair. "That doesn't change the fact that you broke my rules," he muttered, his voice suddenly less sure. Karoline stepped closer to the podium, her words measured, deliberate. "Your rules? Or your personal bias?" She let the question hang for a moment, before continuing. "I'm here on the president's orders to observe a religious case, a group of Christians suing for their right to pray in public. And this," she pointed to the cross on her blazer, "this is my religious freedom protected by the First Amendment. You fined me for wearing it, but tell me, Judge, do you know what the law says?" Hargrove's face darkened. "I don't need you teaching me the law. This is my courtroom, I decide." Karoline didn't hesitate. "No, sir, you don't." Her voice was firm, unshaken. "The law isn't yours alone. Let me remind you of Church of Lukumi Babaluaye v. City of Hialeah, 1993. The Supreme Court ruled that banning religious symbols without just cause violates the Constitution. So tell me, Judge, do you have a just cause? Or is it just because you don't like it?" Silence. The room felt like it had stopped breathing. A few people stealthily snapped photos despite the rules. Hargrove opened his mouth, but no words came out. Mrs. Thompson held her breath, her fingers hovering over the keys. James Wilson gave the smallest nod, eyes alight. He had seen many cases, but never a defendant turned the tables quite like this. Karoline pressed on. "You fined me $500 for contempt." She lifted her chin. "But I have proof right here in this courtroom that this isn't about rules, it's about your bias." She turned to the gallery. "That man," she gestured toward the "I Am King" t-shirt wearer, "is wearing a printed shirt, clearly against dress code. Yet you said nothing." She turned again. "And her," pointing to the woman with the oversized necklace. She's wearing flashy jewelry, but you're silent. Only my cross, a Christian symbol, angered you. That's not law, sir. That's discrimination. Hargrove's complexion shifted from red to pale. His grip on the gavel tightened, but his authority was slipping through his fingers. You're slandering me, he stammered. His voice had lost its bite. Karoline didn't let up. She raised her phone. I've recorded everything. From the moment you called me up to now. Her eyes met his, steady and unyielding. And I've already texted the White House. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Someone in the back shouted, "She's right." Another clapped, only to be quickly silenced by James Wilson. Judge Hargrove's panic was visible. He grasped at control. "Miss Leavitt, I can withdraw. The fine," he stammered, his voice losing its edge. "No need to escalate this." He banged the gavel feebly, but the authority behind it was slipping. Karoline didn't waver. "No, sir. Withdrawing it because of who I am only proves you were wrong." She took another step forward, unwavering. "The issue isn't me. It's how you run this court. I demand a review of the past 6 months' records, every fine, tied to religious symbols. And I propose mandatory First Amendment training for court staff, including you." The courtroom erupted. An older man in the back stood and clapped. "That's right," he called out. A young woman whispered, "Who is she?" "Amazing." Mrs. Thompson, the clerk, typed furiously, her eyes gleaming as if she were witnessing history. James Wilson's lips twitched in the faintest smile. He had known from the start, Karoline Leavitt was no ordinary defendant. Judge Hargrove slumped into his chair, his face ashen. His hands trembled on the gavel. For the first time, he truly saw Karoline, not as a defendant, but as a formidable opponent. "You think I'm just a spokesperson," Karoline said, her voice low yet commanding. "But I've worked with President Trump through countless lawsuits, from elections to policy. I taught myself the law to defend him, and now I'm using it to defend myself and others." She let the weight of her words settle before delivering the final blow. "You just made a big mistake, Judge Hargrove." She pulled her White House card from her pocket, placed it on the bench, and stepped back, her eyes locked onto his. Hargrove opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He had crossed the wrong person, not just smart, but a legal force. The courtroom erupted again. Scattered applause, murmurs of disbelief. Mrs. Thompson typed faster, desperate to capture every moment. James Wilson stepped forward, his expression unreadable, but his eyes full of respect. Judge Hargrove sat frozen, his authority crumbling before everyone's eyes. Karoline stood still. The silver cross on her blazer gleamed, not just a symbol of faith, but her flag of victory. Outside the D.C. courthouse, the late afternoon sun caught the cross on Karoline's collar. She paused at the glass doors, checking her phone. The recording had already been sent to the White House. She typed a quick message to Trump's senior advisor. "Hargrove fined me for the cross. Handled it. Next steps needed." This wasn't just personal anymore, it was an opportunity, a political earthquake waiting to happen. Inside, the courtroom still buzzed. The older man in the back turned to his neighbor, his voice trembling. "I've never seen anyone take down a judge that fast." A young woman whispered to her boyfriend, "That's the White House press secretary. Incredible." Mrs. Thompson printed the session transcript, her hands shaking. James Wilson, the bailiff, stepped outside, phone in hand, already calling a colleague. "You've got to hear this," he said. "A young woman just shut down Hargrove." The news spread like wildfire. Karoline hadn't even reached her car when her phone vibrated wildly. A notification from Cross in court was trending. She tapped the app. The first tweet read, "Judge fines White House press secretary $500 for wearing a cross. She fights back with the law, leaves him speechless." Cross in court. Within minutes, the comments flooded in. "Who is she? Unreal. Hargrove's done." A major conservative account posted, "Proof the system is against Christians. Thank you, Karoline Leavitt." She exhaled, a small smile playing at her lips. The wave had begun. At 4 p.m., President Trump himself joined the storm. His tweet was short but explosive. Karoline Leavitt, my amazing spokesperson, just taught a leftist judge a lesson on religious freedom. Legal genius. We won't let them suppress faith. The post racked up 50,000 retweets in half an hour. Conservative outlets pounced. Fox News headline: White House press. Secretary faces off with judge over cross and wins big. Karoline's phone rang. Trump's senior advisor. You did great, he said, his voice beaming. The president wants this amplified. Prep a statement. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Charles Hargrove sat alone in his dimly lit office. His phone buzzed nonstop. A call from the D.C. Judicial Council. The reckoning had begun. Judge Hargrove sat in his dimly lit office, gripping a cold coffee mug, his hands trembling. The clash with Karoline hadn't just humiliated him in court, it was spreading across the city like wildfire. He muttered to himself, "She's just a young girl, how did this happen?" But deep down he knew, he had collided with something far bigger than himself. Back at the courthouse, Mrs. Thompson couldn't stay quiet. She picked up her phone and called a friend at a local paper. Her voice low but firm. "I've worked with Hargrove for 12 years, she said. He always targets religious symbols, especially Christian ones. She reached into her desk drawer, pulling out a small notebook filled with meticulous notes. Case after case. People fined heavily for wearing crosses. Others warned for Islamic badges. Meanwhile, slogan t-shirts and flashy jewelry had never been an issue. She knew speaking up was a risk. But after today, staying silent wasn't an option. James Wilson took action, too. In the courthouse break room, he recounted the courtroom showdown, with urgency. I counted at least 20 times this year alone that Hargrove fined people for religious symbols, he said. But when it's a rude t-shirt, he laughs it off. One of his colleagues nodded. Leavitt exposed what we all knew but wouldn't say. I'll call the press, another said. This needs to be out there. By 5 p.m., Channel 7, news was broadcasting live from outside the courthouse. Today, White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt was fined $500 for wearing a cross in court, the reporter announced. She fought back, and now the entire city is buzzing. On X, cross in court exploded past 100,000 mentions. People began sharing their own stories. He fined me $200 for a prayer badge last year. I saw him scold a mom for wearing a cross in a divorce case. Then, a short video surfaced. Someone had secretly filmed inside the courtroom. Karoline standing tall, holding up her White House card, her voice ringing with conviction. The clip went viral, hitting 1 million views within hours. Karoline sat in her car on a quiet D.C. street, watching the firestorm unfold. She dialed her husband, a low-key businessman. Her voice was calm but electric. "Honey, I just shut down a judge. This is about to get huge." He chuckled. "You always pull off crazy stuff. Stay safe." She nodded, hung up, and opened her email. A message from Trump's office. "Prep for a press conference tonight. We're turning this into a win." Meanwhile, across town, Judge Hargrove turned on the evening news. Judge faces backlash after fining press secretary. The bold headline flashed across the screen. His face filled the broadcast. He switched it off, his hands shaking. His phone rang again. The D.C. Judicial Council. They wanted answers. By morning, he knew. His 30-year career was hanging by a thread, all because of a 27-year-old woman and her tiny cross. The next day, the D.C. Judicial Council's office buzzed with urgency. News of Karoline Leavitt's courtroom battle had swept through Washington, forcing the council to launch an immediate investigation. Linda Martinez, a seasoned investigator with 20 years of experience, stood before her team, spreading out dozens of case files from Hargrove's court. "We have 48 hours to report," she said, her tone firm. "Find everything linked to Hargrove and religious discrimination." At the White House, Karoline prepped for the night's press conference. At Trump's directive, she combed through the courtroom footage and fired off another email to his advisor. "I've got data from X. Hundreds are accusing Hargrove of bias. Push this hard." Her phone buzzed relentlessly. Reporters, lawyers, supporters. One message caught her eye. A law student. You inspire me. Hargrove fined my mom for a cross once. Karoline exhaled, smiling. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It had reached thousands. Back at the courthouse, Mrs. Thompson stepped into the investigation room, clutching her small notebook. Her voice was shaky but resolute. I've tracked Hargrove's cases for 12 years, she told Linda. He always targeted religious symbols, crosses, hijabs, anything that stood out. But crude shirts, loud jewelry, he let them slide. Linda flipped through the notebook. Dozens of cases. September 14, 2024. Man fined $300 for a cross. October 20, 2024. Muslim woman fined $200 for wearing a hijab. She frowned. This is gold. Thank you. Moments later, James Wilson walked in, offering a handwritten statement. I've been a bailiff here for 15 years, he said, and Hargrove fined people with religious symbols 3 times more than anyone else. Linda nodded. They had enough. Now, the real reckoning would begin.